We will begin with an alternative regulatory mechanism for vernal pools presented by Aram Calhoun of the University of Maine and Elizabeth Hertz of the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, which will be followed by a brief Q&A if you have specific questions for Aram and Liz. Again, if you'd like to ask a question at any time during the presentation, feel free to chat it directly to me under Kimberly Roth, and I'll see that it's addressed. After that, we will see wetland-specific water quality standards presented by Sandy Crystall from New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. After the presentation, we'll have another brief opportunity for Q&A for Sandy, and then we'll have a discussion of both presentations and how these innovative techniques and standards can be applied to our wetland programs and what impacts they make in our wetland programs and ecosystem health. To introduce myself, I am Kimberly Roth. I am your webinar moderator. I'm an environmental analyst with the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission, or NUEPIC, and I manage our wetlands programs. Today, we have Aram Calhoun from the University of Maine. She is a wetland ecologist in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Conservation Biology. Her research focuses on forested wetland and vernal pool ecosystems. She is particularly interested in conservation of natural resources on private lands and collaborative approaches to conserving them. Dr. Calhoun is active in working at all levels of government on wetland policy and conservation issues. Elizabeth Hertz is currently the Director of the Municipal Planning Assistance Program at the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. In her previous position as Senior Planner with the Maine Coastal Program at the Maine State Planning Office, she developed a GIS-based wetlands assessment technique, initiated a coordinated coastal wetlands restoration effort throughout the Gulf of Maine region, and as part of a multi-agency steering committee was instrumental in the development and implementation of Beginning with Habitat program. Ms. Hertz has an MS in remote sensing from the University of Michigan. So I will pass control over to you, Aram.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody that I can't see. I know that a lot of people in the audience are already a vernal pool ecologist or wetland ecologist, so I'm just going to give a very brief background, and Liz will actually be presenting the regulatory mechanism. And I'm trying to advance here. Kim?
Yep.
I'm not able to advance.
Hang on one second. I'm not sure why it's not working.
Oops, that's doing something.
Did you get that?
So I'm going to hit take control and see if I can. Nothing's happening.
Okay, now go ahead and try.
No. Are you able to advance them?
Yes, I can. Let's go ahead and do that.
Okay, so I'm pretty quick on all the slides, so let's go to the next slide. So the background I'm going to give is just basically the pools, a little bit on the policy, and these are sort of the fundamental reasons why we needed to think of an alternative regulatory mechanism that would be an option for folks. Next. So we all know vernal pools are temporary or ephemeral wetlands that fill with snow melt and rainfall in the spring and may refill in the fall, and just keep going. So they are classic vernal pool fills, and then it dries down by summer's end, and this makes an ideal habitat for vernal pool species which are not adapted to living with fish. Problem with vernal pools is they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, so there's no poster child. They can be marshes. Major pool characteristics are they're relatively small, shallow depressions. They have temporary to semi-permanent water regimes and are fishless, which are characteristics are suitable for fairy shrimp, wood frogs, spotted salamanders, and blue spotted salamanders. And these are animals that we know use these pools as critical breeding habitat because they cannot compete with more permanent water species like bullfrogs and green frogs or fish that will eat them. The challenge comes, can we go back to the last slide? The challenge comes when amphibian post-breeding habitat is primary human habitat, and this is where we have the clash in developing landscapes. Next. So the policies and the challenges. One of the challenges for all folks is that the federal and state regulations do not overlap completely. They come under jurisdiction under different circumstances, and even the regulatory management zone differs between the state and federal regulations, which is frustrating for landowners. Next. So in Maine in 2007, we implemented a significant vernal pool program where a subset of vernal pools, landowners must get a permit before they can do alterations to a 250-foot zone. Next. And one of the challenges to protecting pools is that all of these things are hard to inventory. You can't sail in them, so a lot of the values that people give to open water bodies where they can boat and swim and so forth, we don't see with vernal pools. The other challenge, next, is that the vernal pool species do not recognize the 250-foot zone of consultation or management zone, and from a biological perspective, this area is not sufficient for maintaining persistence of pool breeding amphibians. Next. They also have, if you could keep hitting the things, they also have complex life history. So one of the problems is that every species has a different life history need at different stages of juveniles, and adults have different post-breeding habitat needs. And so it's a complex resource to conserve because the animals leave the wetland and we have to worry about adjacent terrestrial habitat, which is also frustrating for the amphibians and for the humans. What this has led to is current policies lead to pools on paper, which means that you might have intact pool systems, but the matrix that the animals travel in or where they hibernate or summer can be greatly degraded. Connectivity can be broken among pools. So the solution is the people. So some of the programs that we've undergone, especially since the 2007 significant vernal pool regulation, was to bring communities into the fold and to pre-identify some of these pools to limit frustration by developers and landowners, if you could click. And this was a voluntary mapping program, landowner permission only, with close cooperation with the state, particularly Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, which oversees a significant vernal pool program. These are the towns that were involved. Next. So what we did was train citizen science volunteers, and the end result of this was the towns that we worked with have a map of potential vernal pools, and where we had landowner permission, we actually did assessments and we know where significant vernal pools are located. So this is foundational that we had these maps in these towns that we were working with. Next. Some of the towns wanted to go beyond mapping, beyond that stagnant database where often it gets pulled out if there are permitting issues or case-by-case projects. But Orono and Topsom both wish to go beyond that and explore how could we use those maps for something a bit more creative. Next. So what Liz is going to talk about is how we turned contention into collaboration so that landowners and developers and folks who are frustrated with the regulations and the current status quo had a way of developing a locally based conservation strategy, and that's where Liz is going to pick up right now.
Am I on, Kim?
You're on.
Okay, great. Can I see if I can make the slides advance? Okay, I'll take control. And nope, looks like you're going to have to click for me to.
Give it a wide swing. Give it a wide swing, and then
here?
All around the screen, and that should make the bar go away. Up. All right.
But I can't advance them either, so if you don't mind.
Okay.
Oh, wait a second. Yes, I can. So I am going to talk about the Maine Vernal Pools Special Area Management Plan, and I'll apologize up front. My slides are not anywhere near as nice to look at as Aram's. There's a lot of text on them, and I'm not going to read it all to you. I'm going to talk about the concept, and then I assume that many of you would download the slides, and you could read the information at your leisure and let us know if you have any questions. So what is the vernal pool stamp? It's an alternate regulatory mechanism that balances vernal pool protection with economic development. It's a partnership. It was developed as a collaboration and partnership among a very robust stakeholder group. And in essence, what the stamp will allow is for development of vernal pools in designated growth areas for conservation of rural pools and their surrounding terrestrial habitat in the rural area. So for instance, in a growth zone, you might come up against a situation like this where you have a pool on a single parcel, but it's become fairly isolated from the surrounding development and certainly isolated from the needed terrestrial habitat. As compared to the situation in the rural area, especially in Maine, where we still have large unfragmented blocks of forest with pools embedded in them, conservation of which would create a much more beneficial landscape to ensure the preservation of these animals over time. So how does it work? Applicants basically will pay a fee to the town when impacting pools. The town's going to transfer that fee to a land trust or other nonprofit conservation organization who will then undertake the conservation of vernal pools based on a set of vernal pool assessment criteria that were established through this process. Not any town will be allowed to do this. There are a number of criteria that a town will have to meet that in the eyes of the stakeholder group, by meeting these criteria, it's an indication that A, the town has capacity, B, shows commitment to the preservation of vernal pools over time, and has a strong enough connection to a third-party organization to ensure conservation in perpetuity. For the applicant, they'll have the choice to either use the vernal pool stamp or go through the existing vernal pool permit process. If they choose to use the stamp, they will deliver as part of their permit application to the town an appraisal of their parcel based on two different conditions. The first would be existing conditions with the vernal pool present. The second is condition as if there were no vernal pools on that parcel, and the fee will be 40% of the difference between those two values. They'll submit a Category 1 self-verification form to the Army Corps and, of course, get all the other relevant permits, but then they'll be off and running. The conservation will be undertaken through the use of the fee that's collected from the applicant. The Land Conservation Organization will use the assessment criteria with the help from university ecologists and state biologists to identify high priority conservation opportunities in the rural area. And then it does become the responsibility of the land conservation organization to do due diligence on those areas and also to complete fee or easement protection and undertake annual monitoring of those pools during the spring breeding season. We assume that there will be likely benefits on all sides of this picture as a result of the Maine Vernal Pool stamp. We're hopeful, and based on the input that we've had from the developers and as well as economic development professionals in this process, that this is definitely going to create a more business-friendly atmosphere and be used as a selling point by communities. It certainly is going to create more predictability in the growth area and will support infill development, hopefully reducing the amount of sprawl that's taking place in adjacent rural areas. On the rural side, this is an opportunity to pay rural landowners for the very characteristics that in most towns are identified as enormously important through the visioning process when they undertake a comprehensive planning process. Most, if not all, towns in Maine include some language that identifies the maintenance of their rural landscape as one of the primary goals of their comprehensive plan. But we never pay rural landowners to do that in any meaningful way. We just expect them to leave their fields open, or maybe they'll hay them. This is an opportunity to remunerate rural landowners for, in fact, providing the qualities that towns say they value. And also it will help eliminate leapfrog development into rural areas if development is stymied by a vernal pool in the growth area. On the ecological side, we're very hopeful that through use of the stamp, we will be reducing, if not removing, the perception of vernal pools as barriers to development. Certainly, we'll be promoting more meaningful protection at the local and landscape level, and that protection will include not only the pools, but the intact forested landscape surrounding them. Oh, I lost my little arrow. There we go. And then for the third party, one of the situations that land trusts frequently find themselves in is the hunt for money in order to make conservation deals happen. And although mitigation funds are not allowed in all land conservation programs, this will offer an additional funding stream to conservation organizations to use in the work that they do. And hopefully for state and federal regulators, we're actually going to reduce the time that they have to spend on project by project permit determination, while at the same time getting better outcomes in relation to protection of the resources. And this is why I do this. These are my lovely grandchildren who, the two older ones, have been to vernal pools with Aram and I and talk about them to this day. So I think for all of us, it's important to recognize that what we do today is in fact going to impact future generations. This is just to give you an idea of who was involved. We had a very large research team, most of whom are housed at the University of Maine in Orono, but it spanned multiple disciplines, including natural resource economics. And then we're done.
Thanks, guys. So if anybody has any specific questions, we can take them now. I didn't receive any during the presentations, but if there's any specific questions, go ahead and send them to me. Otherwise, we'll move on to our next presentation today, and then we can discuss more fully during the discussion portion. So please join me in welcoming Sandy Crystall from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. Sandy is a professional wetland scientist with New Hampshire DES. She has been working on developing the Wetlands Monitoring Program at DES in the Watershed Management Bureau since 2011, when DES participated in the National Wetlands Condition Assessment, and Sandy was the team botanist and regional trainer. In addition to developing the plan for wetland-specific water quality standards, in 2013, Sandy developed the DES Wetlands Monitoring Strategy. She has worked with the DES in the Wetlands Bureau, initially as a permit reviewer and then as the outreach coordinator for the Wetlands Program. She's been with DES for more than 17 years. Can you do the right left buttons?
Yeah, it was just there. Oh, there we go. Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for this opportunity to share our work on wetland water quality standards with this group. I think developing wetland-specific water quality standards is a challenge for the diversity of wetlands. I think the resources required and variations in wetland programs as well. So I'm going to provide some general background on water quality standards, New Hampshire's existing wetland and water quality programs, and how the project unfolded, what we started out to address, and what else was identified in the plan, which isn't on the web yet, but I think we'll be putting it on there shortly. So the Clean Water Act requires assessment of surface waters, and with most wetlands being considered surface waters, there's a need to develop methods and criteria to assess the condition of our wetlands. EPA has identified core elements for state wetland programs, and having wetland-specific water quality standards is one of the core elements. The Clean Water Act also provides additional tools even to those states with their own programs. Therefore, it can help to protect the uses that wetlands provide and complement existing state permitting processes. All right, so this chart shows the various sections of the Clean Water Act that require water quality standards to implement them. There's actually, I think I probably looked at this chart a million times, which I think may have come originally from Region 1, but there's actually, I think, a connection missing with the, I think to get to the implement strategies, you can actually go directly from the top. You don't have to go through the whole loop. But anyway, I'm going to be addressing kind of three major areas, primarily the assessment, the anti-degradation, and the aspects of the 401, the water quality certification. So the three major components to water quality standards are establishing designated uses. So what uses are we protecting the surface waters or wetlands for? The criteria are what characteristics or values are we using to determine the condition of the surface water or wetland? And then the anti-degradation aspect, which requires some procedures, is how we're ensuring that high-quality waters are not being degraded. So, a little arrow disappeared. Oh, okay. Just as a brief background, and probably most of the New England folks are familiar, New Hampshire has its state program in place since 1967 when the permit requirement for dredge and fill impacts, actually to tidal wetlands, it was established in 1969. It was added that the requirement for permits for freshwater wetlands. In 2004, mitigation became a requirement, although we were doing it somewhat before then. And in 2006, we added the in lieu fee program for mitigation. With all of this, while we sometimes consider the condition of wetlands in permitting, we don't end up assessing the condition of our wetlands nor identifying any trends through the permitting process. So in terms of New Hampshire's wetland resources, to determine the condition of our wetlands, we really need to know what wetlands we have by type, by size, you know, in terms of, and their spatial extent. Right now, the best statewide mapping we have is based on 1980s imagery and technology, the National Wetland Inventory Maps, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit. But this is how it breaks out, with almost 50% of our wetlands being palustrin forested, and the balance of them being divided up among the other coordinate types, about a quarter of them being a palustrin scrub shrub, and a sixth of them being like palustrin emergent. So currently, New Hampshire has narrative biological criteria that apply to surface waters and wetlands, and I'll be describing that further. But we have no assessment methods nor numeric translators to use for wetlands. And like most states, New Hampshire is not assessing wetlands as the Clean Water Act directs for all surface waters. And that I'm talking about primarily 305B. Some are assessing wetlands, but not under 305B, and there are other issues there as well. So as with our other efforts, particularly in terms of water quality, New Hampshire has had a Water Quality Standards Advisory Committee for a number of years, and there are often these offshoots like subcommittees that work on various topics that may have actually additional people on them as well. So we established the Wetland Water Quality Standards Subcommittee, and they were, you know, bring a kind of broad expertise, although it's generally a little heavier weighted on the water quality side than actually the wetland side. We did bring in some additional wetland folks. Part of the process involved really researching what are other states doing, what other documents have been produced. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Environmental Law Institute did a survey of all the states and various aspects of their programs. The Association of State Wetland Managers has done several documents on water quality standards for wetlands. EPA has a variety of guidances out there, both technical and programmatic, and there are, you know, increasing number of papers on assessing condition of wetlands of various types. So I think when I started this, I think the focus was, first of all, primarily on looking at really the assessment, like under 305B. As I mentioned, much work has been done to identify what states have water quality standards for wetlands. But I think it was a kind of a major, kind of a mental block for me, because when I looked at what was being described as what states had for their wetland specific water quality standards, they really looked like our state's dredge and fill rules or law. So I think between a couple of the sources of information that the Environmental Law Institute put together that were that basically mapped a lot of the data. It really kind of brought it together that a lot of states that don't have their authority, and you can see if you look at the slide, it's really, the Midwest. Some of those states have water quality standards because they're using 401 as really the only way that they can have contribute to the protection of their wetlands in the federal the permitting process. If you look at a number of states that are that dark gray with a W in them, a lot of them use the there's both the federal process there, but then they've added in their own authorities to address either coastal zone or the isolated wetlands that kind of dropped out of the universe for them. So that's where a lot of the states that are gray and have the W in them. So if you look at the Northeast, really, it looks like nobody has water quality standards. Maine was actually noted as having water quality standards primarily because of their anti-degradation policy, not because of the language in their rules, which I think one of the issues is that, and I think in a slide or two I'll kind of mention that kind of the default criteria that a lot of states are using is not considered, I think in some ways, by some perhaps incorrectly, to be ineffective. But anyway, so this kind of gave me a better picture of understanding why what I was seeing didn't kind of match what I was really looking for. So among the tasks or requirements before putting in water quality standards is ensuring that wetlands are considered as surface water subject to water quality standards, so the water quality standards can be applied to them. So one of the challenges is in New Hampshire, there are so many existing laws and rules that reference surface waters that by adding the word wetlands to them, it would totally change the meaning, cause a lot of problems. Resulted in, there was a work group that had been put into place in 2010 that really kind of examined this issue, and I took another look at the statutes that are in place, and another option was identified to address and ensure that wetlands would be subject to water quality standards. So there's actually language in the plan we talk about if we add the definition of water quality standards and then in that definition state that they apply to wetlands, that would help us get over that obstacle that we have. And then we would also put in the definition for waters of the U.S. That would be subject to the water quality standards. One of the other major aspects I had talked about that kind of pie with the criteria, the designated uses and anti-degradation. So designated uses are really the goals that are set for a surface water or wetland. In the left column here, the lists the current designated uses that are available for us to apply, and they come from statute. They're not called out specifically, but we basically the ones that are most used are the primary contact recreation and aquatic life. That's where we have data. If we had data for some of the other areas, we would be assessing those bodies for those designated uses as well. The group that looked at evaluating designated uses, also another kind of subgroup of that Water Quality Standards Advisory Committee, developed some proposed designated uses, which are very similar to what we apply now. And definitely in terms of wetlands, I think we're looking at aquatic life, and we're looking at the potential for wildlife, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So this slide provides the narrative criteria text that DES has for biological integrity in our rules. This is what I mentioned was that criteria like these are sometimes referred to as default aquatic life use criteria and don't seem to carry equal weight to standards that include the term wetlands. But however, I think that this viewpoint doesn't acknowledge the fact that they can be equally effective. And I think Maine really sets the example as one of the few states nationwide that's assessing wetlands under 305B. Maine relies on a similar narrative statement that applies to all surface waters, and their surface waters include wetlands, and their state attorney has so indicated that. So I think that perhaps we shouldn't be so narrowly focused on if the word wetland isn't there, then it doesn't count as much. So these are the criteria that are there. Obviously, while we talk about the biological and aquatic community, you know, we're working and talk more about how do we determine that we have a functioning community that's similar to natural habitats in the region. So we have been working with Maine and applying their macroinvertebrate protocols and water sampling to open water fringing wetlands because of the predictive model that Maine has developed for water quality in wetlands. Thus, the aquatic life use integrity is assessed through their model. Additionally, we're applying the ecological integrity assessment, which is developed by NatureServe and modified by the Natural Heritage Program in New Hampshire, and bringing in assessment of the vegetation using floristic quality in one way or another, because we're hoping that that will also transition us or help to transition when we want to look at some of the drier wetlands like the palustrin forested wetlands. So you can see that although we're not addressing the palustrin forested wetlands right now, the little red circles above the descriptors really show at least parts of these core and wetland types would qualify as open water fringing wetlands and would be able to be assessed with the protocols we've started to use. So we plan to continue what we started in 2014, continue to sample wetlands that represent a gradient of disturbance, which this past year I think we did a pretty good job of. We were trying to stick to the rotation that the rest of our watershed folks were using for the streams and rivers monitoring, but it was apparent that it didn't quite get at the more developed areas, or it might take going through the whole rotation to finally get there. So we kind of abandoned the rotation and selected our own impacted wetlands in the southern part of our state. So while Maine's model output is according to their legislative classes, New Hampshire will evaluate the thresholds that may be used from that output. So from that, we'd be able to establish thresholds for assessment purposes. So this graph is an example of what we're looking to create for New Hampshire, and this is to bring in that vegetation component. This is from Minnesota. Mike Bordash and others analyzed data collected over many years to develop these ranges of the coefficient of conservatism values for the plants that were in plots. For the wetland systems, this work was done in the development of their rapid forest equality assessment for depressional wetlands. The blue whisker plots represent the range of values for reference in undisturbed wetlands by type of system, and the red whisker plots resemble the range of values, represent the range of values for the more disturbed wetland systems. You can see that at the far left, the reference wetlands for floodplain forest actually have a lower score effectively than what an open bog would be if it's a disturbed wetland. So you can see that the need to establish these values by wetland system type. And in our new wetland program development grant with our, we're partnering with our Natural Heritage Bureau again to develop reference coefficient of conservatism values for about half our wetland system. So we're looking to try and develop something like this that will help assess these wetland types. And be able to once again be used if we are, get out of the open water systems. So this, I wanted to provide an example of what one state has developed for narrative criteria and really how it encompasses all surface waters. So this is Minnesota's application of their narrative standards, and basically they've developed or developing an index of biological integrity for these various groups, whether it's a fish community, aquatic invertebrate community, aquatic plant community, including algae, and then D actually applies to more of the streams and looks at habitat quality. So this is one way that you can, an example of how the narrative standards could be written that would apply across multiple resource types. So beyond the assessment, one of the things that came to mind, we have these other provisions both in the Clean Water Act, and actually there are other authorities that New Hampshire has that really could be more effective at protecting wetlands. So currently, DES requires baseline data for wetlands where there are large groundwater withdrawals. So this is in the groundwater monitoring program. They actually have in rule specific information that has to be submitted with an application. Actually, our surface water withdrawal program does not have comparable rules like that. So our groundwater program really can help set an example for the type of information we need to include in our rules in terms of at least knowing what is the quality, the condition of the wetland when it's been permitted, and obviously there are considerations to be made if certain resources are present. So this both affects not only the water quality certification, but New Hampshire, like I was mentioning, has an authority to require a water quality certification for surface water withdrawals. So we're looking at developing some guidance on what data should be collected depending upon the type of project, and then also for certain projects, are there certain conditions under which they would be exempt from this baseline collection or ongoing monitoring program? That would be like establishment of a larger buffer, moving the work farther away from the sensitive wetland or resource. Another aspect of the water quality standards that hadn't been at the forefront initially when I looked at this, but kind of came to mind, is that currently New Hampshire's outstanding resource waters, an aspect of anti-degradation, is limited to natural segments of our designated rivers and then waters within the White Mountain National Forest. So I would say that a lot of us have ideas on there are other high-value wetlands, either specifically or types of wetlands, that might warrant additional protection under the anti-degradation component of the water quality standards. And so we're looking at working with stakeholders to determine the need to identify additional resource types and identifying those resource types and ultimately putting it into rule. In terms of wetlands mapping, this kind of gridded picture of New Hampshire provides an idea of the very limited area, it's the yellow shading, that has mapping, NWI maps that have been updated since 2004. Everything else is much older. So we know we need to, and actually in one of the wetland program development grants in this current round, we sought funding to update the NWI maps. At least some of them more accurately represent the resource. This will facilitate the ability to conduct probabilistic assessments in the future, although it's not a substitute for sampling to assess individual wetlands, but then we can also randomly select wetlands to assess, which for a variety of reasons is kind of a challenge with the current protocols we're using, and why do it with outdated wetland maps. New Hampshire has basically kind of a two-tier system for classification. Class A is water that can be used for drinking water, surface waters, and B are waters that can be used as drinking waters with treatment. And basically, there's been interest in looking at different classification, maybe a tiered classification approach, a tiered aquatic life use, but that's going to come at a later time and would benefit wetlands likely. So in summary, the plan is to seek changes in statute to ensure that our statute and rules clearly define that water quality standards apply to wetlands. I didn't mention right now they specify marshes, but it doesn't apply to the whole group of wetlands. We want to develop a numeric thresholds that we can use to interpret our narrative standards, starting with our open water wetlands and then expanding to other types. Use the thresholds for assessments under 305B and bring them into criteria in the rules ultimately, and add the requirement for collection of baseline data as part of water quality certifications, both under the 401 and the state statute for surface water withdrawals, and then update the wetlands mapping, which we're on the way to doing. One of the things that I did not mention, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, among the challenges are that when we go from the more open water wetlands to the drier wetlands, you know, there's an increasing need to deal with the private property issues. You can't access public waters by boat. You're on a more drier surface, and there are, you know, private property issues. So I think that makes some of the 305B assessment of the drier wetlands kind of an issue that's kind of looming down the road. So I hope this has provided you with useful information to consider in your own programs, and I welcome questions and input, perhaps suggestions for things that maybe we didn't consider. And once again, I think we'll get the plan put on the web so that you all will be able to take a look at it if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandy. I'm going to go ahead and open up all the phone lines here. If you have questions, this will be the time to start asking them.
Your line has been unmuted.
Right, everybody, you're off mute. If you have questions for Sandy, Liz, Aram, or if you'd like to start a discussion topic, this is the time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us as well. There's been some back and forth between Vermont A&R and Liz about the 250-foot buffer regulation, and Vermont had asked if there had been any studies showing the success of 250 feet as a specific distance.
I actually think, this is Liz, I actually think that Aram can speak to that question the best in relationship to the research that they've done on dispersal distances.
Can I be heard?
Yep, just turn up your volume a little bit. And just as a reminder to everybody, please keep your line on mute if you're not actively discussing.
So I think I heard the question was, is there any evidence about 250 feet being an insufficient amount for dispersal distances? And the answer is there's been a lot of research done on migratory and some dispersal distances of amphibians, and the migration would be leaving vernal pool to go to a summer habitat and then migrating back and returning to pools. Most of the data are from adults, but they show distances far in excess of 250 feet, and that's the concern. And we know that the juveniles often go farther than that. So in order to allow all the processes that allow for genetic diversity, you need connections among different wetlands and vernal pools far in excess of 250 feet. And that's the problem. That's why we're trying to be creative with getting away from a circle around a pool to trying to conserve pools that are in relatively impact forested landscapes where we might be able to protect connectivity in perpetuity. If not 250 feet, any distance would be better than that with connectivity.
There was also another question for you guys. How did you come up with the 40% value?
This is Liz. We did a lot of economic analysis, which I definitely can't explain. There were Monte Carlo simulations run. We took assessors' data and looked at value of parcels in growth areas, outside of growth areas in both towns. And we eventually decided that it made the most sense to use real estate appraisals of the parcels at the moment of development or when the development was being proposed, because that was actually the most sensitive metric in relationship to the value of property at a given moment in time in a particular locality. We got to the 40%, again, the economists ran a bunch of analysis on how much it would cost to preserve 2 pools and the surrounding terrestrial habitat in the rural area of each of the towns. And then we had a figure, and in our stakeholders meeting, with the developers present and actively taking part in the conversation, we determined that at 40% of the difference, we were as sure as we can be that we will be accumulating enough funds to undertake the required preservation in the rural area.
And I would just add that the economists working with us, Kathleen Bell at University of Maine and a PhD student, Vanessa Levesque, also stated that in some cases we may get more money for our value and in some cases less, and that the hope was with their modeling that that would even out over time. So it's not going to be perfect, but they believed with the more numbers participating that it would even out.
Did we have any other questions?
Hi, Kim. This is Beth Alifat. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. How are you?
Hi. Good. I had a question for Sandy. I think one of the advantages in the Maine water quality world is the biological monitoring is all done in one group, and Jane and others are able to sort of work with that group of people in the biological monitoring world. And I'm just wondering if that kind of relationship is similar in New Hampshire, or if that's something you're working towards, and how receptive has the water quality world, the other world, been to bringing wetlands into the fray?
Yeah. I mean, well, the fact that I've sort of been that go-between between wetlands and watershed really for the past 4.5 years is the wetlands folks still generally have their program to implement in terms of permitting and such. So, that doesn't go away, and that's, a major effort. A lot of the other aspects are really more tied to, the decisions made with the water quality certifications that are up in our watershed bureau. But there has been kind of conversations and working together, and I think, in fact, under the current grant, we're working on kind of like memoranda of agreement in terms of reviews of things and, collaborating on stuff. So, I think, since we're still in a testing mode, we'll see how things go forward. But there's been, cooperation between the groups, although most of it still rests in our Watershed Management Bureau.
Thank you, Sandy.
Sure.
Hi, Sandy.
Yes.
Hi, this is Jean Voorhees. It's really nice to hear the work that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a new position at EPA, and I'm now the Water Quality Standards Coordinator for the region. So you know how this is near and dear to my heart. So this is great. One question I had is I think way back when you folks, I don't know if you had, I'll just ask the question. In the past, for the, I think it's called the CALM document,
right,
where And that there was I thought a placeholder in there for wetlands, but it hadn't been, it was just a placeholder. So I'm wondering, one, is that still the case, or am I thinking of a different state, and whether or not wetlands have made it into the CALM document in New Hampshire?
Well, I think until we develop enough data to establish some thresholds, I'm not sure that it will make it into the COM, which is the Consolidated Assessment and Listing Methodology. I know there are others on the line that may be able to provide additional comment on that, but I think that, you know, once we develop some thresholds for assessment for the designated uses, then we'd put that into the COM, and we would, you know, put it out for comment as we do every year before the integrated report.
Okay.
So I don't know about the placeholder aspect, but that would be the first place our, you know, the threshold for assessing wetlands would go into the COM.
Okay. I'm just wondering if there's like, and again, I've been away from this for a while, so I'm wondering I can't recall what some of the other states have in theirs, but it sounded like you do what we used to call like a level 1 or level 2 assessment. Is that true? Because it sounded like you were using the ecological integrity assessment.
Well, that's one part of it. I mean, really, the work we're doing with Maine is really level 3 with collecting macroinvertebrates, taking water grab samples. We're using meters. We're also surveying vegetation. We are also, you know, in parallel doing the ecological integrity assessment, and we're doing Maine's wetland human disturbance assessment. It's like all of these things, and so then we can see, okay, how are they scoring with each one? How representative is it? What is the macroinvertebrate, the linear discriminant model output? You know, what kind of bin does it put it in and such. So really trying to combine these to see how best to characterize the sites.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I was kind of thinking whether or not there was a way to look at incorporating something that you've done with, you know, some of the monitoring you've done into the COM, even if it was like a Tier 1 assessment. But I get what you're saying.
Well, we've actually done a level 1. It was reported, I think, in the integrated report in 2012. And I think actually we had done another version in 2008. So we've done a level 1, which is a GIS-based. But since our NWI maps are so out of date, it's really not really worth putting a lot of time into that effort. And then we need to see whether the relationship between what the level 1 predicts and what maybe our field sampling showed, and how they compare.
That's great.
Great,
good
thanks.
To hear you're moving along.
Yep.
Were there any additional questions or ideas that people would like to share? You can also raise your hand if you are muted and would like to speak as well.
Yeah, hi, Kim. This is Trish Garrigan at EPA. And I just had a question for Aram and Liz. Hi, Liz. I'm just wondering what happens to the wetland that, you know, is no longer protected as a vernal pool in a growth area. I mean, is there any hope that they can remain in some sort of natural state, or is it kind of understood they'll disappear? I'm just coming from the point of view where I think it's good to have nature in developed areas as well. So can you speak to that at all?
Yes, I have thoughts on that. It is good to have nature in developed areas as well, and that's what I think a lot of urban wetlands perform that function, but we're talking about a very specialized wooded habitat and functioning as a vernal pool with fragmented forest around it, and every landowner around the pool being able to develop their portion of the pool is not good for long-term persistence of this specialized breeding group. So I agree completely that urban wetlands and ponds have their role, but to pretend that we're conserving vernal pool ecosystem functions in highly developed landscapes is not really honest.
No, I totally agree with that. I guess I'm just wondering, what do you think will happen?
It's not the total growth area. We're limiting it to a subset of the growth area that has been zoned to be completely built out. And in return, we're hoping that we get more pools conserved in rural areas with the appropriate post-breeding and hibernating habitat. So in some cases, it may be that the pool is not filled, but what it does is it allows a developer to develop within those 250 feet or 750 feet. And at that point, the pool may just become a typical pond with green frogs and what have you, but at least we're not pretending that it's a functioning vernal pool.
Right. Okay. Thanks. And just Kim, I just wanted to mention, and maybe there's more questions, but we will be circulating through you shortly just a list of everything that got funded under the Wetland Program Development Grants for the coming years shortly, and one grant will be going to the town of Topsom to continue working on the Vernal Pool stamp project, so that's kind of exciting.
Yes, it actually allows us, we're also working with Orono on that. It's Orono and Topsom and our whole stakeholder group, and it will allow us to address the question that you've asked to see how the program's working, if we're sure that it's meeting the mission of our regulatory agencies of conserving biological, chemical, and biotic integrity of these wetlands. And we will have an annual review of how we're doing with the SAMP and a 5-year major review to see if it's working. So it's a voluntary program, and this grant that we've gotten from EPA will allow us to help the towns begin implementing it, doing the field work, setting up the mechanisms for this annual reporting, and trying to figure out how do we tell if the financial fee mechanism is working, and how do we tell given it's in the short term, but if we feel like it's being effective conservation in the rural area.
Yeah, you don't know till you try, right?
Right, and it's just really nice to have the EPA funding, because instead of handing the SAMP to the towns and walking away and saying good luck with it, this has allowed us to actually give them technical support throughout the first couple years of this.
Well, not hearing any other questions on the line, I'm just going to throw this up here. Thank you all for attending. Our next webinar will be December 10th at 1:30, the same time. We're going to continue with the second Thursdays. We're going to have 2 presentations, one from Mass DEP and one from the New York City Departments of Parks and Rec. Both will feature mapping techniques of threatened and vulnerable wetlands. If you have any questions or comments, you can send them to me at kroth@nuipic.org, or if you're attending this webinar today and aren't on the distribution list, please send me an email if you'd like to be added for future announcements for future webinars and calls. Thank you again to Aram, Liz, and Sandy.
Thank you.